Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep on this book, Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe. It's a book that's pretty controversial. It challenges a lot of our assumptions about how government works.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging read, but we've picked out some really interesting bits for you. We're going to look at Hoppe's views on monarchy and democracy, and then something he calls the natural order. It gets a little wild.
Right off the bat, one thing that stands out is this concept of time preference. What does that even mean, and why does it matter so much in Hoppe's arguments?
Okay, so think of it this way. Time preference is all about how much you value something right now versus maybe getting something better in the future. We all have different time preferences. It's
hmm
like, would you rather have a small candy bar right now or wait a whole week for a giant one? It's that kind of choice.
So someone with a high time preference wants that instant gratification.
Right.
They're not really thinking about the long game. But how does this whole thing time preference? I mean, how does it connect to government and, society as a whole?
That's where it gets really interesting. Hoppe's argument is that a society where people are willing to delay gratification, so a society with a lower time preference overall, has a better chance of being prosperous and successful. If you imagine a society where everyone's saving, investing, and building for the future, that's a society with a low time preference.
But wait, isn't that a contradiction? We want governments to provide services like schools and roads and stuff. But Hoppe seems to be saying that those very things could actually make people less future-oriented.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What Hoppe argues is that a lot of government actions, especially when they kind of mess with property rights, well, they create uncertainty about the future. If you're not even sure if you'll get to keep what you earn, why bother saving and investing, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
This uncertainty basically pushes people towards thinking more short term. So it raises the overall time preference of the whole society.
So it's kind of like the more the government steps in, the less secure we feel about the future, and the more we're tempted to just live for today. It makes you wonder if even some good government policies, stuff that's meant to help, could actually be holding us back in the long run.
Yeah, that's the core of his argument. He even uses this really interesting analogy to try to explain it. He compares how time preference changes to like growing up from childhood to adulthood.
Okay, now I'm curious. Explain that a little more for me and for everyone listening.
Well, just think about it. A child wants everything right now, right? They have really high time preferences. But as we grow up, we learn to delay gratification. We go to school, we save for retirement, our understanding of time kind of changes, and we get more comfortable with making sacrifices today so we can have a better tomorrow.
So is Hoppe saying that too much government is like keeping society in a state of childhood? Like it stops us from really growing up and thinking long term?
That's a great way to put it. It's like a society with a high time preference is kind of like a teenager, right? Impulsive, focused on instant gratification, not really thinking about the consequences down the road. But a society with a low time preference that's more like a responsible adult, patient, planning for the future, thinking about the legacy they'll leave behind.
Wow, this is really interesting. So how do monarchy and democracy fit into all of this? Are they both equally guilty of this, like fostering this teenage mentality?
That's where things get really controversial. Hoppe argues that even though they're both forms of state power, they actually have pretty different effects on time preference. He
Hmm.
even makes a case that, believe it or not, hereditary monarchies might encourage a lower time preference than democracies.
Hold on, he's saying monarchies are better for long-term thinking. I mean,
That's
isn't it
not.
usually the other way around? We think of democracies as being more progressive, more forward-looking.
Yeah, it might seem that way at first. But you got to remember, Hoppe's coming at this from a very specific angle. It's all about the economics and the incentives involved. His argument is that a monarch who sees the whole country as their own personal property, they'll act more like someone making a long-term investment. They'll be more interested in making sure it keeps its value for future generations.
Hmm. So it's kind of like the difference between owning a house and renting an apartment.
Right.
You can take better care of something if you actually own it.
Exactly. The monarch has skin in the game, so to speak. Their wealth and their legacy are directly tied to how well the nation does over the long term. But a democratically elected official, they're only in power for a limited time.
So let me get this straight. Hoppe's suggesting that a monarch, because their future is totally tied to the country's future, might be less likely to make short-sighted decisions, even if those decisions would benefit them right now but hurt everyone later on.
Yeah.
Like running up a ton of debt that future generations would have to pay off.
Exactly. He'd say the incentives are totally different. A monarch's thinking about their dynasty, thinking generations ahead. The elected officials often just thinking about the next election. And that difference, he says, has a massive impact on the kind of society we end up with.
It's like comparing a CEO who's trying to build a company that will last forever versus a politician who's just focused on winning the next election. Two totally different mindsets.
That's a great way to put it, and that's where we start to see the beginnings of what Hoppe calls the tragedy of the commons in democracy. He sees government as this publicly owned resource, and because of that, politicians are tempted to exploit it for short-term gain, even if it ends up hurting the whole system in the long run.
This is raising some tough questions. I mean, are we just stuck in this cycle of bigger government and less freedom as long as we keep having democracies? I'm really curious to dig into this whole tragedy of the commons idea. But I think we should probably wrap up part 1 here. What do you think we should pick up on next time?
Well, in part 2, we can really get into that tragedy of the commons concept and explore how Hoppe sees it playing out in democracies. We can also look at some of his specific criticisms of the whole democratic process and how its built-in mechanics might actually lead to the very problems he's warning about.
Sounds like a plan. We'll see you back here for part 2 of our deep dive into Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, The God That Failed. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're still digging into Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, The God That Failed. And last time, we were talking about this tragedy of the commons idea. Kind of scary stuff.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful concept, and it's right at the heart of Hoppe's whole critique of democracy. He sees government in a democracy as this, like, common pasture, open for anyone to exploit if they get political power.
Right, okay. Just to refresh everyone's memory, how does this tragedy of the commons thing actually work? It seems like it's key to understanding why Hoppe's so down on democracy.
Okay, so picture this. You got a pasture that's shared by a bunch of herders. Each herder wants to graze as many cattle as they can on that land, right? Makes sense. More cattle means more money for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then, what happens if every single herder does that? Well, the pasture gets totally overgrazed, the land gets ruined, and in the end, everyone loses.
Right, I get it. It's like individual self-interest leading to the destruction of this shared resource. But how does that apply to democracy? I mean, we vote for politicians to manage things for the good of everyone, right?
Well, that's the idea, at least. But Hoppe argues that in a democracy, the incentives just don't work that way. He sees politicians as being like those herders. They're always tempted to overgraze the pasture of government. They make promises to all these different groups. They expand government programs. They spend taxpayer money, basically, to buy votes.
So they're like maxing out the national credit card to throw this huge party today and leaving future generations to deal with the debt.
Pretty much. And the thing is, there's no real owner of the government in a democracy. It's not like there's this one person who feels the long-term consequences of all that overspending. So there's just less incentive to be responsible.
Right.
Hoppe even compares this to a monarchy, as weird as that might sound, where a king, since he sees the country as his own personal property, would be more careful to preserve its value over time, for his heirs.
Yeah. It's kind of like that saying, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine too. In a democracy, the government's resources can feel like nobody's responsibility, so everyone just grabs what they can.
Exactly. Now, look, I know this idea that a monarchy could be more responsible than a democracy sounds kind of crazy to a lot of people, but Hoppe's not really trying to say monarchy is better. He's just pointing out the potential downsides of a system where the commons are constantly up for grabs, like a free-for-all.
This is making me think about the whole debate over national debt. Is Hoppe saying that democracies are just naturally prone to spending too much and racking up debt? Because that seems to be happening a lot these days.
Yeah, that's a big part of his argument. He sees this short-sightedness, this willingness to kind of mortgage the future for quick gains, as baked into the whole structure of how democracies work. Elections naturally make politicians focus on what's going to get them votes now, not what's best for the country 20 or 30 years down the line.
So like a politician who promises to cut taxes or give out more benefits right before an election, even if it means adding to the national debt, that's them playing right into this tragedy of the commons dynamic.
Exactly. They're basically grabbing as much as they can from the common pasture while they have the chance, even if it means there's going to be less left for everyone later on. Overgrazing the land, so to speak.
This is all pretty depressing. I mean, are we just doomed to keep repeating this cycle of overspending and losing freedom? Is there any way to get out of this tragedy of the commons trap?
Hobbes not very optimistic. He sees this historical pattern. Monarchies turning into democracies, and alongside that, you get bigger government, more spending, more debt. He doesn't think democracies are very good at reforming themselves.
Yeah, but haven't there been times when democracies have done well and even expanded individual freedoms? How does he explain that?
Oh, he doesn't deny that there have been successes, but he sees those as the exception, not the rule.
Okay.
He says the fundamental incentives of democracy, they always push towards a bigger government, more intervention. He points to things like, the welfare state getting bigger, bureaucracy growing, property rights getting weaker, all evidence of this long-term trend.
It's hard to argue with some of what he's saying. The world does seem to be moving towards more government control, not less. It makes me wonder about that whole time preference thing again. Are we, as a society, are we just getting more impatient, more short-sighted?
That's a good question. And Hoppe would say yes. This trend toward bigger government, more spending, more willingness to just pile on debt, it's a symptom of a society that's got a high time preference. And he thinks democracy itself, with its short election cycles and how it incentivizes politicians, it actually encourages that impatience, that short-term thinking.
It's like we're all choosing the small candy bar now instead of waiting for the bigger one later. Okay, so if Hoppe's so critical of democracy, what's the alternative? Is there a different way to organize society that avoids this whole tragedy of the commons problem?
Now that's where things get really interesting. And that's what we'll talk about in part 3. Hoppe proposes this radical solution, a system that's not based on government control at all, but on private property, voluntary interactions, free markets. He calls it the natural order.
Now we're talking a world without government. That sounds kind of chaotic. Or maybe like utopia, depending on your perspective. Can't wait to hear more about it. We'll see you back here for part 3. Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've been going through Hans Hermann Hoppe's critique of democracy, right? All this stuff about time preference and how democracies are prone to this tragedy of the commons. Now, for the big finish, let's talk about his solution, the natural order. It's a pretty big departure from what we're used to.
Yeah, for sure. Hoppe basically imagines a society where government, as we know it, just doesn't exist. It's a world built entirely on private property, voluntary agreements, and the free market. Even stuff like roads, security, courts, all provided privately, not by some central authority.
I'm having trouble picturing this. So
Yeah.
no taxes, but instead I got to shop around for my own private security force, maybe get a subscription service for the roads I use. It sounds like a libertarian fantasy or maybe a dystopian nightmare, depending on how you look at it.
Well, Hoppe's argument is that this kind of system would actually be way more efficient and better at protecting individual rights than any government could ever be. He says competition in a free market would lead to tons of innovation, lower costs, better services overall for everyone.
Okay, but let's get real. What about something like national defense? That's a huge, complex thing. Can private companies really handle that? I mean, wouldn't we be sitting ducks without a proper army?
Hoppe actually addresses that directly. He thinks even national defense could be handled by private agencies, all competing to offer the best protection to their clients. He argues that this kind of system would be much more responsive to what people actually need and way less prone to wasteful spending or getting dragged into wars we don't need to fight.
It all sounds so decentralized, like a whole bunch of private groups all fighting for customers.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea, but wouldn't the strongest security force just end up taking over everything? Wouldn't we just wind up with a different kind of government, one that's run by corporations instead of politicians?
That's a common concern, and Hoppe talks about it. He puts a lot of emphasis on reputation and non-aggression. His idea is that in a truly free market, any company that resorts to violence or coercion, they'd quickly lose customers and face pushback from competitors. He thinks self-interest would basically keep everyone in check, even the most powerful players.
It seems like that takes a lot of faith in the invisible hand of the market. I mean, we've seen how even now big corporations can have a ton of power, and sometimes they do things that are really bad for society. Why should we believe they'd suddenly become all good and responsible just because the government's out of the picture?
That's a fair point, and it's something a lot of people who disagree with Hoppe bring up. He admits there's no guarantee of perfect outcomes, but he argues that a system based on voluntary interactions, where people can choose the services they want and hold providers accountable, would be much less likely to have the kind of corruption and abuse of power that we see in government.
It seems like individual responsibility is at the core of Hoppe's whole vision. It's like he's saying, if you want a better world, stop waiting for the government to fix things and take charge of your own life. That's a pretty bold statement, and I'm sure a lot of people would find it controversial.
Definitely. Hobbes is a strong believer in individual liberty, and his natural order reflects that. He really thinks that when people are free to pursue their own interests without interference, they'll naturally create a more prosperous and just society. He sees government as a meddling force, often causing more problems than it solves.
But what about people who can't really take care of themselves in a completely free market? The poor, the sick, the elderly. Wouldn't they get left behind in a system with no social safety net?
Hoppe believes that private charity and things like mutual aid societies would step in to help those in need. He's actually really critical of government welfare programs, arguing that they just create dependency and discourage people from working. He has a lot of faith in people's natural generosity and their willingness to help each other out, especially when they're not being forced to do it through taxes.
It's a very different way of looking at things. I can see how parts of it might be appealing, but I think a lot of people would be scared to imagine a world without any kind of government safety net at all. It feels like a massive gamble.
No question about it. Hobbes' ideas really challenge how we think about government, about society, about pretty much everything. Whether you agree with him or not, his work forces us to ask ourselves some tough questions about the systems we live in and the trade-offs we make between things like security, freedom, and prosperity.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive into Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. As we wrap things up, what's the one thing you'd like to leave our listeners thinking about?
I think the most important thing Hoppe offers is this challenge to think critically, to question everything. Don't just accept things the way they are because that's how it's always been. Explore different ideas, consider other possibilities, and have real conversations about the kind of world we want to create. Even if you don't agree with his natural order idea, just grappling with his arguments can help you think more clearly about the role of government, individual freedom, and all the complexities of how societies work.
It's a great point. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into some really thought-provoking ideas. We encourage everyone to check out Hoppe's work for themselves and see what they discover. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep